Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Ruy Teixeira. Subscribe here, wherever you get your podcasts, and of course over at undercurrents.tv for even longer versions of these interviews and the full premium experience. Now, last week, the Teamsters Union made history. Big history. For the first time since 1996, that was an election between Bill Clinton and Bob Dole, the Teamsters declined to endorse the Democratic nominee for president. Now, on the other hand, what might be a loss for Democrats is also something of a loss for Republicans. Sean O'Brien, the head of the union, actually spoke at this year's Republican National Convention. Then the DNC snubbed him about a month later. The union released internal polling results on September 18th. As our friend Batya Ungar-Sargon said, wow. Batya wrote, 58 to 59% of rank-and-file Teamsters chose Trump in an internal poll versus just 31 to 34% who chose Harris. Batya continued, this represents an absolutely massive drop-off after Biden dropped out of the race. Biden was leading Trump by 8 points with rank-and-file, according to Teamsters polling. Now, here's how the Teamsters describe themselves on their website. Our 1.3 million members are public defenders in Minnesota, vegetable workers in California, sanitation workers in New York, brewers in St. Louis, newspaper workers in Seattle, construction workers in Las Vegas, zookeepers in Pennsylvania, healthcare workers in Rhode Island, bakery workers in Maine, airline pilots, secretaries, and police officers. Name the occupation, and chances are we represent those workers somewhere. Now, in the Rust Belt, those votes will matter a lot. And actually, apart from the election, these patterns are reflecting shifting sentiments among America's working class. This is not just about votes. It's about the fabric of the country. Joining us now to make sense of all of this is probably the best person you could talk to about it, Ruy Teixeira, a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and author of the very popular Substack, The Liberal Patriot. Ruy joins us now here in our Washington, D.C. bureau. Ruy, I want to start with the Teamsters non-endorsement. From your vantage point as somebody who studies these patterns very closely, how significant or not was the Teamsters non-endorsement of Kamala Harris?
Well, I think it's significant in terms of overall, sort of political trends in America. The labor movement is changing. There are at least parts of it that are becoming more open to the Republicans. This is a reflection of that. In a sort of micro sense, like right now, right here, right now, I don't think it changes much because basically union leaderships endorse, not endorse, whatever. It just doesn't have that much effect on how rank and file union members actually vote. Maybe, it sends a signal to other voters, this candidate is okay. If Union X votes for them, people aren't in the union, but the theory of it always has been this is how you get union members to vote for the preferred candidate. And this has not been true for a while. There's been a lot of divergence between the preferences of the union leaders and the union members. For example, I talked at the International Union of Operating Engineers the other day, and, all the leadership, 150% for Biden. He was the candidate at the time. And, I saw some of their internal polling. It was like 2-1 for Trump. So you see the same thing with the Teamsters. Even though they're not endorsing, they did poll their membership. And it's like heavily for Trump at this point against Harris.
More heavily when it was Trump versus Harris than Trump versus Biden.
Right. In fact, didn't Biden have a slight lead?
He may have.
Yeah. So it's pretty different. I mean, we don't know how that particular, how the horse race with Biden might have evolved if Harris had never gotten in the race among these members. But
what accounts for that? Why is it different for people when it's Biden versus Harris?
Well, I think Harris is not widely loved among, sort of working class, sort of parts of America. She's more the candidate of college-educated America. And you can see that. And since she's entered the race, the Democratic ticket is doing better among college-educated voters, particularly white college-educated voters, doing worse among working class voters writ large. So that's part of it. And, a lot of these Teamster members, they may be, sort of classic white working class type voters who maybe don't really care too much for Harris, who is perceived as being quite liberal in a way that Biden was not. But again, we don't know. It could be like if you'd polled these same members 3 months after their initial Biden-Trump result, it might have been, pro-Trump, right? Because the campaign had evolved. We just don't know. And we've seen this for a while, that the strength of the union household vote for Democrats has been declining. And early signs are that we may see more of that in this election, not only working class, weakening of the working class vote for Democrats, but even the union vote for Democrats may be less than we've seen in a while. The most loyal union members, they aren't, what we think of as union members in a sense, private sector workers, your Teamsters, your auto workers, your steel workers, whatever. They're people who work in the public sector. They're teachers, they're government workers, and they are heavily Democratic.
So I was watching Kamala Harris's recent town hall with Oprah, and I didn't
see that. What was that like?
You missed a great show. She had at one point, I'm somewhat sarcastic when I say that, but as I was watching it, I'm thinking to myself, as somebody who's fairly conservative, this seems to me a sign, as much as, I don't love Kamala Harris and have plenty of disagreements with Kamala Harris, but she is tacking so hard to the center. She is so focused on patriotism.
Right.
There's almost a 3 Fs emerging: faith, fracking, and firearms. She said, you don't have to give up your faith to believe in women's reproductive rights. She said, I have a gun. This was the most extraordinary moment.
Well, didn't she say she was going to shoot somebody if they...
Yes, she said, if you break into my house, I'm going to shoot you. And then said, I probably shouldn't have said that. But also on fracking, she's tacked to the center. What do you make of Democrats? Clearly, the Harris campaign is sitting in their offices and saying, this is going to be beneficial for us electorally.
Oh, sure. That's entirely what it's about. Has Harris changed her underlying views on the nature of guns and the nature of crime and the nature of energy production? Lots of other things. It's a little hard to say, right? She disavows these positions and says this kind of tacking to the center kind of thing, but she doesn't really talk a lot about, why is that? And nobody's really pressing her on it. It's kind of like my values are the same, but, now I believe all this different stuff. Okay, well, why is that? How did you finally figure out your values weren't consistent with what you had said before? And why did you say what you said before? These questions aren't answered. And I think one reason why the whole tacking to the center thing is not really producing as big payoffs as probably they would like, particularly among moderate to conservative working class voters, where I don't think it's had a lot of effect. In an odd sort of way, I think part of what this does is reassures, moderate college educated voters that, they can vote for her. She's a viable candidate. She's not going to say crazy things. For what in theory would be the target of this moving to the center, people with genuine objections to the Democratic brand and a lot of this stuff. That's not clear to me. It's going to make a huge impression. I mean, it does have this sort of performative aspect to it, somebody comes in my house, I'm just going to shoot him, okay, yeah, great. And, fracking, I love it, but what is your position on energy production? And I just wrote a piece that came out today or yesterday on energy abundance, not climate action, as the road forward for Harris. And I just tried to argue that it's one thing to say you're not for banning fracking. It's another thing to say you're actually for energy abundance, you're actually for more oil and gas production, and your priority is energy abundance, not, and low energy prices, not necessarily fighting climate change. But I think she wants to have it both ways. She wants to have like the standard Democratic position implicitly on energy production and clean energy transition. At the same time, she says, I'm okay with fracking. And it doesn't really quite compute. And I think for the median working class voter out there, they've got to wonder, am I really, how different really is she? Is she just saying this to get elected? And actually one interesting signal of that, right, is how the climate groups themselves, to stay on this issue, are reacting to it, which is like, I get it. Who wants to get elected, And of course we know that when she's in office, she's still our person, right?
Sure.
She's still in our corner. And I think they're not crazy to think that.
She's kind of winking at them, maybe.
Yeah, it's nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I think there's a lot of that, which again, I think helps keep her coalition together and again, reassures some of these white college-educated moderates that she really is kind of moderate. But it doesn't really, I think, close the deal with a lot of these undecided or persuadable working class voters out there.
And we see both parties obviously doing that every every presidential election. Trump is doing it right now on abortion.
Yep.
Can you actually talk to us about abortion? Because Republicans are feeling pretty good that Sean O'Brien spoke at the RNC and not the DNC. DNC kind of snubbed him, and they feel like they've made these big gains. As I was covering the RNC in person, I was thinking to myself, I actually cannot envision Sean O'Brien speaking at a DeSantis coronation. I can't envision him speaking at the convention of any other Republican in, say, 2028 or 2032. So where do Republicans actually stand with working class voters? Is this something that is durable post-Trump with any other sort of Republican figurehead who even Trump at times, J.D. Vance at times, is in a little bit of a pickle when he has to talk about things like right to work and the PRO Act? Right.
Yeah, no, it's the Republican Party's a big mess, The sort of ascendant faction, it's not even faction, it's really the dominant group, are these sort of working class oriented, more populist, sort of anti-traditional Republican economics people, right? They're, to put it in, I don't know if you know this debate, the national conservatives and the free conservatives, NatCons and free cons. The NatCons really have enormously more influence than they did when Trump initially was elected in 2016. They really dominate a lot of the discourse in the Republican Party. But there's still a big part of the Republican Party that is not convinced. They basically want to kind of tone down the rhetoric. They want to keep the working class voters, but get back to what they think is a correct kind of economics, which is more traditional supply side, soft Reaganomics. I mean, there's a lot of disagreement even within that group, the free cons, about exactly what do we mean by that. I mean,
big time.
Whether and to what extent do we need to change our views on things? Of course, we can't be like the NatCons. They're crazy. But, we do have to recognize things have changed. I mean, that was sort of the traditional reformicon position.
Yes.
We're still conservatives, but we recognize things have changed a bit, so we need to do at least a little bit here, a little bit there. But that debate's completely unresolved, not only within the free cons, but the free cons versus the NatCons. You look at all the people in the Republican Party who, maybe they're probably gonna vote for Trump, right? But they really don't like Trump, and they hate J.D. Vance, right? I mean, they miss no chance to rag on Vance. So nobody's very happy with anybody else at this point, which does raise the question: what happens when Trump's off the scene, either if he loses this time or if he manages to get reelected after 2028. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's a mess.
I was going to say, in disclosure, I was a NatCon signatory, and, I've had plenty of debates about the merits of the movement, but something that NatCons struggle with enormously is social issues, marrying populist economics and populist kind of culture stuff, like being anti-PC, anti-media,
right.
Marrying that together with being virulently, staunchly anti-abortion, like a J.D. Vance.
Right.
So I'm curious, because I think that's genuinely a blind spot of a lot of people on the right who say most of the country is with us on culture issues, but also are extremely anti-abortion. That is actually a huge blind spot, because most of the working class is not extremely anti-abortion. Or maybe you have different nuance on that, Roy. What do you see?
No. If you look at the data, it's pretty clear that the median working class voter, including the working class voter who leans toward the Republicans at this point, they're not for they're certainly not for abortion bans, and they're not for, super strict limits even. I mean, what Ross Douthat wrote an interesting column the other day about pro-life realism. You have to take account of, this is in some ways basically a pro-choice country at this point. So you have to figure out within those constraints, how can you do the most to limit, in a sense, the availability of abortion, or at any rate, at least to sort of hold the line against a significant sector of the Democratic Party that simply wants abortion available at any time for any reason without any questions, which is extreme.
Absolutely.
And not what people want, not what most voters want.
And the media gets it wrong.
Right. And the media will obviously not do you any favors on this issue. But Republicans have handled it terribly. I mean, they've let themselves be characterized. I mean, there's a big wing of the party that really does. The really strict social conservatives, the really strict pro-life faction would really like to either ban it entirely or at least limit it to the first 6 weeks or whatever. I mean, stuff that is viewed by most, Americans as being kind of draconian. If they could get the debate more on what's a reasonable approach to abortion, then they would, they do much better, I think. And, I think Trump's thing of let's leave it to the states is a good first step, at least. It's kind of what you can do at this point to diffuse the issue a little bit. But, okay, people will still ask you what your position is. And, he was forced to take a position on the Florida referendum. So it's, J.D. Vance, as you point out, his apparent views on abortion are pretty strict. So, what do you do?
Well, actually, let's talk about J.D. Vance because you've watched his rise really closely. And someone asked me a really difficult question the other day, which is, has J.D. Vance ultimately helped or hurt the Trump ticket? As of right now, it's still September. But what do you make of that? Because the NatCon argument for years was this is the politically advantageous route. The more politicians talk like J.D. Vance, act like J.D. Vance, the better off the Republican Party will be. But that came with J.D. Vance, a suite of comments that he had made on podcasts when he wasn't even a politician, talking about abortion, talking about cat ladies.
Well, right, but that wasn't the populist economic stuff that got him in trouble. Right. It was the kind of, aggressive, anti-woke culture wars kind of stuff, where he was kind of a wise guy at certain points and had said a lot of stuff that was so easy, to oppo, right? It was so easy to weaponize against the ticket. And the media, of course, generally center-left media just eats this stuff up. What could be worse than referring to childless cat ladies? It's kind of an amusing little shtick of his, right? But the shtick in the context of a presidential election doesn't work because of the way our politics works and the discourse works. So yeah, in retrospect, maybe it wasn't the best pick. At the time, obviously, they thought they were, sort of had a really high probability of winning the election, so they could afford to take a bit of risk and set J.D. Vance up to be the next, Trump successor or whatever. The best laid plans of mice and men. What can I tell you?
And the flip side of the J.D. Vance coin, I actually genuinely think is Tim Walz, who Democrats say is so bold about his populist leftism, transgenderism, climate, and took actions that were, people would say be unpopular in a state like Minnesota that has that vast rural north that is actually pretty pro-Trump. He did a rally in Detroit, in Duluth. Right. So I guess I'm curious what your take is on Tim Walz. He reminds me personally of a Randy Bryce. If you remember Randy Bryce.
Oh, yeah, I remember old Randy Bryce. Yeah,
Irish Stash. Yeah, he emerged to run against Paul Ryan in the Kenosha area, south of Milwaukee, and failed spectacularly because it felt to a lot of people like a LARP that elite Democrats latched onto. I'm trying to sell you populist economics with this friendly tone. I'll wear a hunting vest and send pictures of myself getting a deer. Right. What have you made of his candidacy?
Well, Walz is like, at this point at least, he was a little bit different when he was a representative, is sort of like a liberal coastal elites idea of what a white working class guy from the Midwest should be like. If they were, they just knew what the real interests were or something. So, what they love about Walz is he's got all these, this vector of socially liberal positions and all the things that these kinds of folks care about at the same time as, he wears the hat and, he's sort of, and he does have a bit of, he is a sort of populist in economic terms. He has done some things in Minnesota that, sort of fit into that standard prairie populist mode, but he's also at the same time, he's a candidate of Minneapolis in the suburbs. They love him. If you look at how he's run in the rest of Minnesota, it's not so great. So yeah, I think it's a vexed pick for them in that way. I think his projected appeal to the working class voters was actually not that much. Again, I think it's who is this pick really for? It's not necessarily for the working class. It's for the people who want to feel that the ticket is for the working class, i.e. the people who aren't in the working class but want to vote for Harris and feel really great about it. But I still think, you would be better off picking Shapiro. I don't think the reason why she's ahead, and if she is in Pennsylvania by a small margin, is because of Walz. It's because of other factors. And if you still believe Pennsylvania is most likely to be the tipping point state, and you need somebody who at least codes is a little bit more moderate than Harris, then, he would have been the obvious pick.
Sure.
But for whatever reason, she didn't want to do that.
Well, let's talk about let's go to the most basic question. What is America's working class voting on? Because we can talk about what they believe on various issues, but what's actually animating them when they're deciding A, whether to vote, and B, how to vote. As you've looked at this, what do you think is front of mind for working class voters going to the polls?
Well, I think the basic question of the nature of the economy, the effects of inflation, sort of who do I trust at this point to run the economy in a way that's going to benefit me and, bring down prices, make the economy generally work better. I mean, we know from looking at the data, working class voters give Trump a heavy, lead on that question, more so than other parts of the population. And that's basically what drives Trump's advantage on the issue of handling the economy. So it's their number one issue, and they trust Trump more in it. So that's key. Another critical issue, though it's not nearly as high as the economy, is immigration, where Trump is way more trusted on the issue of immigration than the Democrats are, than Harris is. And that's another thing pushing them in that direction. And of course, immigration connects to that whole vector of cultural issues that they feel that they feel like Harris isn't really quite in their corner on, that she's a representative of the liberalish Democratic Party in a way that puts them off in a lot of ways. We know, for example, the New York Times poll showed that, it's still the case even after the debate that many, many more people think that Harris is too progressive or liberal than think that Trump is too conservative, right? So there's that whole kind of cultural clash between the working class and how they see the world and how they at least think the Democrats and Harris see the world. And I think immigration's related to that, crime's related to that, some other things are related to that. Democrats, I never cease to be amazed that they wind up thinking like, yeah, I get it, culture is kind of important, but it's not really important. If we just talk to them about, their interests, about, our great populist economic programs, and just talk about it all the time, everything else will disappear. It doesn't really matter. It's just like, it just confuses people. And if we can get them to focus on this other stuff, but to get through the door to talk to a voter, you have to make them feel that your values are simpatico with theirs and you don't look down on them. And your worldviews are at least somewhat consistent, right? And Democrats really, they tend to elide that. Even the people who think that some of Democrats' cultural positions are unhelpful. I think they stop short of thinking, well, we really got to move in a different direction then, because, that would, maybe they believe in those left-wing cultural positions, maybe they don't want to deal with the conflicts within the party, but they have this sort of illusion that if you simply talk about economic issues enough and in the right kind of way, it will solve all other problems. And I just think this does not comport with how voters, particularly working class voters, think and have thought forever, really. I mean, come on. I mean, this is, people don't read, your pro-party policy program and sort of annotate it and, think carefully about, on net, who do I benefit the most from? Like sort of my rational calculus about, the policy set that's on offer. I mean, in a broad sense, that's part of it, but it also has to do with how they view the party and whose side it's on and what they, what their values are and how they're consistent with mine or not consistent with mine. So I think that's really, in a way, kind of astonishing at this point in history that people would think that this stuff somehow can be avoided or worked around. I mean, part of it, too, is that one reason why they don't want to deal with the cultural stuff and they think they can get around it is because for them, I think a lot of the way they look at the cultural disconnect between the working class and the Democratic Party is it just reflects their backward attitudes, right? Their racism, their xenophobia, their sexism, what have you, right? All these various things represent the ways in which the working class has lagged behind the Enlightenment that is now taking over our society, right? And so you can't, what could you do about that? You can't do much about that. You've got to emphasize this other stuff. And if you're going to deal with cultural stuff at all, you don't move in their direction. You try to explain to them why they're wrong, and why they don't have the proper attitudes. Or I guess as Harris is now doing today, you make some broad seeming concessions to their point of view and hope that's enough, right? I'm going to shoot that person in my house. I'm going to be tough at the border. I'm going to be whatever, I'm going to be out there with my hard hat fracking. Not too plausible, but I think this is this is about as far as they're willing to go at this point.
One of the battlegrounds for not just the culture war, well, the combination of the culture war and the economic war, that would be the area by Detroit, Dearborn, in this critical state of Michigan, where margins in the last couple of elections have been very slim, to say the least. This is all playing out. What are you seeing outside of Detroit, in Detroit, outside of Detroit, around areas like Dearborn, heavy auto manufacturing areas, that the green energy revolution is disrupting economically in huge ways? And Democrats probably don't realize that it's not just about the economics. It's about that cultural sense that we are enlightened and you're holding us back.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's still a big factor in this election. I think Democrats had hoped, for example, that the IRA and other bills that were going to funnel some money into these areas and jumpstart this green energy revolution would bring the working class over to their side. It would convince them we have, what we're all about is helping the working class. But I think here we are today in this election, and I don't think they've really made the sale. I would expect in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, what's really going to drive their ticket forward is increasing support among college-educated voters, not increasing support among the working class. They'll be if they can, they'll be lucky just hold Biden's level of support. But it looks like in a lot of the polls they're running behind that. So that, I think, is the end result of maybe eventually these investments will pay off in a big way for the working class in these states. But we don't know. Of course, famously, a lot of this money has gone to red states where it doesn't seem to have affected things very much. But certainly the theory was that eventually this would sort of change the economy in these states in such a way that would lift up working class people in a big way. These working class people aren't seeing it yet. They stubbornly refuse to be happy. But maybe in a few years it will. I mean, we just don't know. But so far it's been, the payoff hasn't been big, and I think Democrats are a bit resentful about that. It's kind of like, look what we did for you, and this is the thanks we get.
They're almost, yeah. Well, and the cultural elements of the Green Revolution are totally, I don't think Democrats anticipated how the Inflation Reduction Act would then be used by Republicans in ways that are, they talk so much about the gas stove ban in New York City. Right. You try to really pin that on Democrats all around the country. Small things like that.
Well, I was at a conference the other day where David Shore spoke. And one thing he said, they do an enormous amount of testing of different themes and ideas for Democratic candidates. And he said the single worst thing they tested was talking about electric vehicles. It was like, the absolute worst. It was like, I'd rather have you talk about defund the police than talk about electric vehicles. So, I mean, it's clear that, the Democrats' idea of, the climate change driven revolution in energy, the clean energy transition, which was so incredibly important that we have to spend all this money on and we have to reorient our economy toward it. It was never popular with working class people. I mean, it was never popular with ordinary voters. This is a project of the elites. This is a project of the most educated, active elements of the Democratic Party who really are convinced that climate change is an existential crisis. And whether they like it or not, we have to do all this stuff. And sort of the conceit behind it, or the thing that made them not think very carefully about how it might be received, as we're going to do all this stuff to fight climate change, but they talked themselves into believing that as they did it, it would produce all these other economic benefits. It's like a soft version of the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal's original idea was we're going to spend $1 gazillion on rapid transition to renewables. And at the same time, it's going to create massive numbers of green jobs, good union jobs. Everybody's going to be happy. And I think this was an illusion. It's actually pretty hard to do an energy transition. It takes many decades, right? And they're just way over their skis in terms of, the feasibility of what they're trying to do, and certainly its political salability. For most people, climate change is it's not even a secondary, it's a tertiary issue, right? And yet, it to some extent defines in the public mind, particularly among working class voters, this is really what Democrats care the most about. This is what they believe. This is what they're willing to spend money on. And, so far it hasn't, they haven't made the sale. Now, if they'd spent all this money on the IRA and all of a sudden, and sort of had this orientation toward renewables, and it had produced a much better life for people that they immediately saw. That would be one thing, but it hasn't, right? And in fact, one thing that gives the lie to the whole thing, and Harris did admit this in her debate, is, we're producing more oil and gas than ever. We're hitting new records. I mean, this reflects the fact that you can't, at this point in time, our society and the world as a whole will continue to run largely on fossil fuels, and we have to produce, especially natural gas, right? And it was always nutty, the idea that you could, remember when Joe Biden said in 2019, I'm going to end fossil fuel. Oh yeah, how are you going to do that, buddy? So, I mean, this was always cloud cuckoo land. Right. And I think they're now sort of having to implicitly admit that that's not going to happen anytime soon. And that we're going to, it's sort of back to all of the above, though I guess Harris called it diverse energy sources, but it's the same idea. But it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to really convince people you're for energy abundance, you're going to produce more natural gas, you're going to go heavy into nuclear, and you're going to dial back the, solar wind stuff.
Sure.
Which would be consistent with an actual idea of it. And your fundamental goal is to have that abundant energy and keep prices low, right? That's what people care about. They care way more about the price of the energy they consume than they do about its contribution to combating climate change, right? It's just a fact. We all know this. This is not like, some obscure, secret of the polling gods. I mean, it's very obvious, and it's been proven time and again. So I mean, I think that the optimistic interpretation of some of the things Harris has said is maybe behind the performative stuff. Maybe there is a sea change in how Democrats are thinking about things, or at least the way people in back of Kamala Harris are thinking about things, and how they might be different if they actually do get elected. They might sort of take this as an opening to pursue more moderate or more sensible and more realistic policies in this and other areas. However, I've got my doubts. I think that, back to that nudge, nudge, wink, wink stuff, right? I think for a lot of the left activist groups that are now 190% in for Harris, I think that's how they view it. I wrote a piece the other day I called The Rise of Vince Lombardi Democrats. Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. And right now they're willing to put up with anything she says, anything she does, as long as they actually get her elected. And then hopefully it's back to business as usual.
Well, Ruy, I'm from Wisconsin, so you're quite literally speaking my language right now. The great Vince Lombardi knew how to move the ball down the field and win the game. Well, this has been fascinating. Ruy Teixeira, thank you so much for joining us here on Undercurrents.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's edition of Undercurrents. Remember, we are here every day, and it's so much fun, by the way, to have people here in the studio. So tune in for more of that, especially as we head full steam ahead to the election on November 5th. A lot more where this came from. Remember to subscribe to the Undercurrents YouTube channel. Wherever you get your podcasts, subscribe to Undercurrents. And if you want the full premium experience, head on over to undercurrents.tv. We'll see you here tomorrow.